Imagine a filmmaker so obsessed with the perfect image that he actually borrows high-speed satellite lenses from NASA.
Right.
Yeah, just to shoot an entire movie by candlelight. I mean, it's wild. Then picture a director who forces his cast to run through the exact same scene up to like 80 times.
Which is just grueling.
Completely grueling. He grinds them down psychologically until they cross this threshold where they stop performing and just enter a state of pure, raw existence.
Yeah, it's a completely different level of intensity.
It really is. Now, top it off with a creator so relentlessly uncompromising that when one of his most successful films triggers a wave of death threats and copycat crimes, he doesn't issue a statement. He doesn't apologize.
No, he just pulls the film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He simply pulls the film from distribution himself, basically deciding that an entire country is no longer allowed to watch his work.
You know, we usually think of modern cinema as this massive chaotic machinery of compromise, right?
Oh, for sure.
You have studios, producers, focus groups, budget committees, all just watering down a vision. But what you are describing is a singular, almost terrifying will treating a multi-million-dollar industry as his own private sandbox.
And when we talk about Stanley Kubrick, that is exactly the level of absolute control we are dealing with. So welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack the man behind the camera for you.
Because you're likely already familiar with the iconic monoliths and the haunted hotels.
Right. We aren't going to just list off his greatest hits here. We really want to understand his evolution. We want to figure out how a kid from the Bronx with terrible grades who hustled people in public parks somehow hacked the rigid Hollywood studio system.
To achieve a level of artistic dictatorship that no one had ever seen before.
And that we will probably honestly never see again.
No, definitely not. To understand the mechanics of how he operated on a set later in life, we really have to look at the environment that built his teenage mind. Because he was born in Manhattan but raised in the Bronx, and despite testing with a genius-level IQ, his attendance at William Howard Taft High School was, it was abysmal.
He was a thoroughly mediocre student. Huh?
Totally. He skipped class constantly just to go sit in movie theaters, and later in life he openly argued that traditional schooling was structurally incapable of stimulating critical thinking.
Which makes sense when you consider how his mind worked. I always find it fascinating when you have a brilliant kid who completely rejects the standard system.
Yeah, the traditional path just wasn't for him.
So his father, who was a doctor, clearly recognized that his son was incredibly sharp but totally unengaged. So he gives him two gifts that essentially become the operating system for his entire career.
Oh, absolutely.
He teaches a 12-year-old Kubrick to play chess, and a year later, he hands him a Graflex camera.
And you know, what's fascinating here is how his background as a still photographer shaped everything. The choice of that specific camera is vital here.
Because it wasn't just a basic camera.
No, a Graflex in the early 1940s was not a simple point and shoot. It was a heavy, complex piece of mechanical equipment used by press photographers. You couldn't just snap a picture casually.
You had to actually work for it.
Right. You had to look down into this dark hood at a ground glass screen where the world appeared upside down and backward. You had to manually set the focus, calculate the exposure, and physically insert film plates.
Wow.
Yeah, so giving that to a teenager forces them to slow down. It forces them to stop looking at the world as a series of fleeting moments and start seeing it as, like, a puzzle of light, geometry, and mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you pair that mechanical obsession with chess. And to me, chess is the ultimate metaphor for Kubrick's entire career.
Oh, 100%.
He approached filmmaking exactly like a grandmaster, always calculating 10 moves ahead, manipulating every piece on the board, and refusing to leave anything to chance.
Yeah, think about how a grandmaster actually views the board. They don't see the pieces as individuals. They see a grid of intersecting vectors and controlled zones.
Exactly. And when Kubrick eventually steps onto a movie set, he blocks a scene exactly like that. He's looking at a lighting grid, treating his actors not as humans with unpredictable emotions, but as deliberate pieces that must be maneuvered to secure the board.
And he joined the United States Chess Federation, actually. He frequently credited the game for giving him his foundational patience and discipline.
Which he really needed for photography.
Right. He actively applied that discipline. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't going to film school. He was working as an apprentice photographer for Look magazine.
That's so young to be doing that.
Yeah, he eventually became a full-time staff photographer, crafting these dense, highly atmospheric photo essays. He did a famous one called Prize Fighter, documenting a middleweight boxer.
So he's already telling stories.
Exactly. Because he spent thousands of hours framing still images, he inherently mastered visual storytelling, composition, and lighting long before he ever picked up a motion picture camera.
But a magazine salary only goes so far, and this is where the hustler mentality comes in. To supplement his income, he would spend his free time in Washington Square Park and various Manhattan clubs playing chess for quarters.
Which is such a great image.
It really is.
Yeah.
You have to picture this quiet, analytical kid sitting on a park bench, separating tourists and locals from their spare change by outthinking them, and then taking that money to buy books on film theory, or to go study the complex camera work of European directors.
And that aggressive, self-funded hustle is what catapults him into motion pictures. He takes the subject of his boxing photo essay, Walter Cartier, rents a camera, and shoots a 16-minute documentary called Day of the Fight.
Out of his own pocket.
Pretty much. He spent about $3,900 of his own money to make it and sold it to RKO Pathé for $4,000.
A $100 profit. I mean, it's not exactly a blockbuster payout.
No, not at all.
But it is the ultimate proof of concept. He learns he can manage a budget, operate the equipment, and actually sell a finished product. And that gives him the audacity to quit his steady magazine job and launch into his first feature film, Fear and Desire.
Right, the infamous first feature.
He passes the hat around to his family, getting his uncle, who was a pharmacist in the Bronx, to invest on the strict condition of getting an executive producer credit.
Naturally.
Right, so they scraped together $9,000.
Which quickly spirals out of control. He took a tiny crew into the San Gabriel Mountains, intending to shoot a silent film to keep costs down, but adding sound and music later ballooned the budget to over $50,000.
Ouch. That's a huge jump.
It was a brutal learning curve. He made terrifying logistical mistakes. At one point, trying to create an atmospheric fog effect for a scene, he used an agricultural sprayer filled with crop dusting chemicals.
Wait, what?
Yeah, he essentially engulfed his own cast in poisonous gas without any proper ventilation.
Oh my God. You hear stories like that and realize how chaotic independent filmmaking was back then. I mean, he literally almost wiped out his actors trying to get the perfect lighting texture.
Yeah, safety wasn't exactly the priority. And the film was a commercial disaster. Later in life, he considered it a bumbling, embarrassing amateur exercise. He went so far as to actively track down and attempt to destroy all the prints of the film to wipe it from his record.
That is dedication to curating your own legacy.
Yeah.
But, the foundation was laid. He goes back to hustling chess in Washington Square Park, and that is where he meets James B. Harris, a producer.
A very fateful meeting.
Yeah, they form a company together, and this directly leads to his first legitimate Hollywood pictures. We get The Killing, which is this incredibly tight crime film.
And we should clarify why The Killing was so revolutionary at the time. It utilized a nonlinear narrative.
Right.
Instead of telling the story of a heist from beginning to end, it fractures time. It shows you the same event from the perspective of different characters, looping back on itself. It was a structural puzzle.
Which is super common now, but back then.
Exactly. Decades later, Quentin Tarantino would heavily cite that specific structural manipulation as the primary blueprint for Reservoir Dogs.
Wow. And then following that, he directs Paths of Glory, an anti-war film starring Kirk Douglas that is so unflinching and critical of military command that countries like France and Switzerland banned it for decades.
Yeah, it was highly controversial.
And this connection with Kirk Douglas is what sets up the biggest collision of Kubrick's early career. Douglas fires the director of his massive historical epic, Spartacus, and hires Kubrick to take over.
This is a monumental shift. He goes from managing tiny, scrappy crews to a $6 million budget with over 10,000 extras.
That's a massive leap.
Huge. He became the youngest director in Hollywood history to command an epic of that scale.
Wait, so his massive Hollywood breakout, the movie that won 4 Oscars, was actually the exact experience that made him swear off the Hollywood studio system forever.
Yes. Because he absolutely despised the experience. Up until this point, even on his low-budget failures, he was the Grandmaster. He controlled the board.
Right.
Suddenly, he is dropped into a studio machine where Kirk Douglas isn't just his lead actor. Douglas is his boss.
And you can't just tell your boss what to do.
Exactly. The studio executives are constantly breathing down his neck, demanding rigid adherence to conventional schedules, while Kubrick wants to meticulously experiment and improvise on set. The friction was endless.
So how did he handle that? Because he wasn't going to just give in.
Well, because he didn't have the authority to dictate the schedule on set, he weaponized the post-production process. He took control of the physical film reels. In the editing room, where he finally had his isolated control back, he vengefully sliced out almost all of Kirk Douglas's dialogue in the first 30 minutes of the movie.
It is incredibly petty, but also brilliant.
Yeah.
I love that you might think of a director as just the person yelling action, but his real power was understanding that whoever physically cuts the negative owns the story. Still, Spartacus goes on to be this massive commercial juggernaut. It wins 4 Oscars. For almost any other young director, this is the moment you buy a mansion in Beverly Hills and lock in a 10-picture studio deal.
But not Kubrick.
Right. Instead, Kubrick looks at this massive success and decides he will never let a studio dictate his terms again.
Spartacus gave him the ultimate leverage. It proved to the world that he had the logistical genius to orchestrate a massive canvas. But it proved to him that absolute creative purity cannot exist under a studio microscope.
Yeah.
If he was going to continue in this industry, he needed absolute dictatorial control over every single variable. And Kubrick proved that a director didn't need to live in Los Angeles to dominate Hollywood. By physically distancing himself, he protected his creative purity.
Because he literally packs up and flees America. He relocates to the UK initially to shoot Lolita because of financing structures and Peter Sellers' schedule.
Right.
But he realizes the physical distance is a massive advantage. He ends up buying Talbot Bury Manor in Hertfordshire, England, and basically refuses to leave.
His wife, Christiane, described it as a perfect family factory. This was a completely revolutionary approach to the industry.
How so?
Well, the established logic was that if you wanted studio money, you lived in Los Angeles, you took the meetings, and you played the political game. Kubrick completely inverted that. By physically removing himself by thousands of miles, he built an impenetrable fortress around his process.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like moving to a remote island, refusing to take meetings, but somehow still getting massive corporations to foot the bill for your wildest experiments without asking questions. It reminds me of a modern tech founder, you know?
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, the ultimate power move isn't just isolating yourself. It's about vertical integration. You own the servers, the code, the UI, the entire ecosystem. That's what Kubrick did with his Manor.
He centralized the research, the writing, the editing suites, the telex machines for production management.
He essentially built a private, vertically integrated studio in his house.
And you see the immediate result of that unchecked freedom in his next project, Dr. Strangelove. He begins with the intention of adapting a very serious, grim political thriller about a nuclear standoff.
Okay.
But because he is sitting in his manor, completely insulated, reading dozens of heavy military strategy books on mutually assured destruction, he has an epiphany. The logic of nuclear deterrence is so inherently absurd that it cannot be treated as a drama.
Right, it's madness.
Exactly. If a studio executive were looking over his shoulder, they would have demanded he stick to the thriller genre that sells tickets. But Kubrick, answering to no one, pivots the entire multi-million-dollar production into a pitch-black comedy satire.
And from there, he pushes into science fiction with 2001, A Space Odyssey. And the level of granular control he exercises here is staggering.
Oh, it's unmatched.
He spends 5 years developing it. He wants a level of scientific realism that borders on a documentary. He's negotiating access to observe NASA spacecraft. But the most revealing detail about his methodology is the music.
Yes, the music is such a key part of this.
He originally commissioned a standard original orchestral score from Alex North. But during the editing process, he was using classical music as a temporary track to help pace his cuts.
The realization he had in that edit bay is a perfect distillation of his philosophy. A traditional original score is designed to manipulate the audience. It tells you when to feel sad, when to feel scared, when to feel awe.
And he hated that.
Kubrick despised being told how to feel. Classical pieces, like the Johann Strauss waltzes he ultimately used, exist entirely independently of the narrative action. They don't react to the spaceships. They simply exist alongside them.
That's a huge shift.
It strips away the emotional manipulation and replaces it with a cold, almost transcendent seriousness. It was a massive financial and creative risk that completely altered the language of science fiction.
Now, you might be hearing this and thinking the film was instantly recognized as a masterpiece by everyone, but that wasn't the case at all. The legendary film critic Pauline Kael notoriously savaged 2001.
She really did.
She called it the biggest amateur movie of them all, and claimed Kubrick basically just did every dumb thing he ever wanted to do without anyone stopping him.
But history, of course, vindicated his methods. 2001 earned him his first and only personal Academy Award. And not for directing, but for Best Visual Effects, because the in-camera techniques he engineered were decades ahead of their time.
But when you construct a fortress where no one can tell you no, that isolation breeds a dangerous level of obsession. Moving into his later films, you stop seeing a director just pushing the boundaries of cinematic technology. You start seeing a man pushing the boundaries of human endurance.
Because he never left his bubble, his hyper-focus on the minutiae of his constructed worlds began to take a severe toll. Let's look at A Clockwork Orange.
Right?
His vision of dystopian youth violence was so stylized and so relentlessly extreme that it sparked an absolute panic in the British press.
It received an X rating, but it went beyond bad reviews. The British media started blaming the film for real-world copycat crimes. He began receiving credible death threats against his family.
Which had to be terrifying.
And because he controlled the rights, he didn't issue a PR statement or try to defend it. He personally pulled the film from British distribution. For decades, until after his death, it was literally impossible to legally watch A Clockwork Orange in the UK.
That threat of violence kind of followed him, too. During the production of his next film, Barry Lyndon, which is an 18th century period piece, he was shooting on location in Ireland.
Okay.
Because the script featured English soldiers, he became a target for the IRA. The threats were severe enough that he had to pack his family onto a ferry under assumed identities, flee the country entirely, and reconstruct the Irish locations back in England.
That's insane.
Right.
But Barry Lyndon is also where we see his technical obsession reach its absolute peak. He wanted the interior scenes to look exactly like classic 18th century oil paintings.
Yeah.
No electric movie lights, only actual candlelight.
Which is a nightmare to shoot.
Right. Standard movie cameras cannot expose film in a room lit by a few candles. So he tracks down these incredibly rare high-speed f/0.7 Zeiss lenses that were engineered specifically for NASA to photograph the dark side of the moon from satellites.
And to appreciate how insane this is, we really have to look at the physics of an f/0.7 aperture. The lower that number goes, the wider the lens opens to swallow light. But the physical trade-off is your depth of field.
It gets smaller.
With that lens, your focal plane is practically paper thin. If an actor leans an inch forward to emphasize a line, their face completely blurs out of focus.
Oh, wow. So they couldn't move.
Exactly. It requires agonizing, unnatural stillness. The actors essentially had to be locked into place, completely restricting their natural movements just to serve the mechanical demands of the camera.
So what does this all mean for the actors? I mean, is demanding 80 takes on a set like The Shining the mark of an unrelenting genius trying to find truth? Or is it just psychological warfare against your own cast?
Well, Kubrick had a very specific, deeply calculated mechanism behind this. He viewed actors essentially as emotion-producing instruments, but he believed that as long as an actor is consciously thinking about their lines, their marks on the floor, or their technique, they are not fully present. They are just pretending.
Acting.
Right. By take 40, 50, or 60, the actor is physically and mentally obliterated. They are so utterly exhausted that the conscious brain shuts down. They stop acting and enter this involuntary, unconscious state where the raw, unpolished emotion finally breaks through.
It all comes back to the chessboard.
Yeah.
He's just moving the pieces around, grinding down his opponent, which in this case is his own cast's ego, until they are exactly where he needs them to be.
That's exactly what he was doing.
And it's entirely his vision.
Yeah.
Stephen King infamously detested Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining because Kubrick completely ignored King's core themes.
Yes.
Kubrick only cared about solving his own puzzle.
And that puzzle solving required an almost frightening refusal to compromise his logistics. Look at his Vietnam War film, Full Metal Jacket. He had developed an intense phobia of flying. He outright refused to get on a plane to shoot in an Asian jungle. The traditional studio move would be to compromise, hire a second unit director, and fake it.
But Kubrick doesn't do traditional. Instead, he brings Vietnam to his backyard. He finds a derelict toxic gasworks in London and decides he is going to reconstruct the ruined Vietnamese city of Hue right there in the rubble.
It's just wild.
He imports 200 living palm trees from North Africa, trucking them in at 1,000 pounds apiece. He orders thousands of plastic tropical plants from Hong Kong. He turns his phobia of flying into a production constraint, fabricating an entire war zone where he can perfectly control the weather, the lighting, and the environment.
It is the ultimate manifestation of his worldview. Reality is not something you document. Reality is something you bend, construct, and perfect, provided you apply enough sheer willpower and resources.
And that obsessive drive did not fade. He maintained it right up to the very end. He was almost 70 years old, working grueling 18-hour days under total secrecy, editing his final film, Eyes Wide Shut. Tragically, he suffered a fatal heart attack in his sleep, just 6 days after screening the final cut for his family and his lead actors.
Because he was a man who lived his life planning 10 moves ahead, his sudden death left behind an incredible archive of unrealized ambitions.
The most famous being his Napoleon epic. The scale of this was terrifying. He spent 2 years just reading hundreds of biographies.
Right.
He designed a production where he planned to borrow the actual armed forces of an entire country. He mapped out logistics to feed, clothe, and direct up to 40,000 real infantrymen and 10,000 cavalry.
Which is a whole military operation in itself.
The studio ultimately canceled it because the budget was incomprehensible, but it shows how his mind scaled.
He was also deeply invested in a futuristic fairy tale about a robotic child called AI, artificial intelligence. He spent years commissioning concept art and refining the story, but he eventually concluded that his own cold, analytical style wasn't right for it.
So he actually gave it away.
He personally handed the project over to Steven Spielberg.
Wow. And Spielberg eventually directed it after Kubrick died, working directly from Kubrick's meticulous notes and storyboards. Spielberg later remarked that the entire process felt like he was being coached by a ghost.
It's such a haunting, perfect description of how Kubrick's influence operated. He was a ghost in the machine of the film industry, a man who mastered the system by entirely rejecting its norms.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought for you to take away today. Stanley Kubrick spent his entire life trying to mathematically eliminate compromise. He treated his art like a grandmaster treats a chessboard, refusing to make a single move until every variable was perfectly aligned in his favor.
Right.
But look at the landscape of the world you and I live in today. We are surrounded by rushed production schedules, endless content streams, and algorithmic decision-making that reward speed over depth.
It's all about speed now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, is that level of obsessive, uncompromising perfectionism even survivable anymore? Does his genius lie in the specific movies he made, or does it simply lie in his absolute stubborn refusal to ever let someone else touch the board?
That's a great question.
It makes you wonder, where in your own life could you apply just a little bit of that unapologetic discipline? Where are you settling for a standard light bulb when what you really need is to hold out for the NASA lens?
It's an exhausting standard to live up to, but it is precisely the friction required to make something truly immortal.
Until next time, keep diving deep.